You're listening to a Countout Podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Stardom Road podcast here on the Countout Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Scott Edwards, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Trent Brewer. Trent, how are you on this fine day?
I'm going well, not a lot's been happening lately, but I'm happy to get on here and do some podcasting, dive deep into the best promotion in wrestling, and dive deep into one of the best factions in wrestling, which is a nice little allusion to what we're talking about if you can't read what the topic is about today.
Yeah, so first off, I just want to thank everyone for checking out the beginner's guide. That I know that went over pretty well with a lot of people. They got to learn about the wild world of Stardom and kind of set us up perfectly for what we're doing now. We're finally going back to the Stardom Road roots, right? We did a lot of current day conversation for the good folks at home, in part of kind of making an annual thing out of it. Hopefully we'll, every start of the year, we'll do the tier list, which people loved. And then we will also do the beginner's guide to help people out. But if you can read, you know what we're talking about today. And that, of course, is Donna del Mondo DDM, because that group is no more. So it's only right that we kick off our first ever faction series on the podcast with one of, if not the greatest factions in the history of Stardom. Their domination of 4 years is unprecedented. And we will kind of go through what their history or what they'll go down as by the end of this. This first episode, we're going to talk 2020 and 2021. And then the second episode, we will talk 2022 until the very end of their time at the top. And in the third episode, we will be doing matches, key matches of DDM's history. So you can probably guess what some of those are, but it should be a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to diving in to DDM.
Yeah, look, when we were talking about doing this show, Stardom Road, and we were talking about the topics we can do, obviously wrestlers came up, titles and all of that. We had talked about factions, and we hadn't committed to a first faction to cover. I know myself, I was thinking, we'll probably end up with Oedo Tai because they've got such a long and rich history, or even Queen's Quest because they've been involved in some absolutely pivotal moments. Donna del Mondo wasn't the faction I thought we'd be starting with, but I also wasn't expecting Donna del Mondo to pack up shop and finish up when we came into 2024. So, like, the big concern whenever we do these kind of episodes about current things is what if the story changes? We can always come back and cover it, but it's always nice when the book has been closed, essentially. And with Donna del Mondo, obviously there'll be some ripple after effects that'll be happening, but the main story is finished now. They've written that book, they've closed it, they've sold it to the public. And it just makes it that much easier for us to go back and look at its impact because we can look at the full 4-year story.
Obviously, the future of Giulia is why we are here. But if you look at the 4 years, it really does feel like they perfected the run of this group. Like, the goal of it to the very end, the original 3 members, win the world title. It almost all felt like this was supposed to happen this way. Obviously it wasn't, obviously certain things happen, but like when it came to an end, it felt right almost because listen, DDM of what we know it as was not the DDM we saw it as in the final months of the group. And I think that's going to be fun part of this conversation, because one thing for me is I'm just going to give like real time feelings for once. So that's fun for me. And I just remember like watching the interest levels and the fan the fan reaction to this group over the 4 years is really going to be a fun part to lean into, because it was not as bright and shiny rainbows as it was when, you know, they closed down. Everyone's like, oh no, like I'm so sad. Like that, if you that happened 3 years ago, people would have probably been amped. But what things were able to change, what this group was able to accomplish. I'll just start off by saying this before we get into it. I always compare DDM to one thing, and it's not another faction. It's Io Shirai's dominance in Stardom. Like, it's the only thing I can compare it to, because they were always the story.
Their story was really interesting because, like, normally you're looking at one wrestler and they've got one overarching story at any one time. But because Donna del Mondo was a faction, they were able to, this is the wrong word to use it, but I think for people who were following as long-term fans at the time would probably agree, they managed to infect the Stardom dialogue and the story, overarching story of Stardom on a complete level. Because you had all of these wrestlers coming in, especially that first year and a half, all of them were instantly positioned as major players in their respective areas. And you didn't see that with a lot of factions. They'd always start off strong when they began. We've seen that with the more recent groups like God's Eye. They come in, they do really well right out the gate, and then they kind of peter back to being at a more respectable and even level. Donna del Mondo kept that going for a long time, and to a nearly absurd degree. And so it is fascinating to go back and look at it now when, you know, I don't want to say the rose-tinted goggles are at their brightest, because like they were really good from the beginning, but there was such a hesitation to embrace Donna del Mondo for a lot of long-term, at the very least, Western fans. And I think it's going to be interesting, you who came into Stardom just about right when they began. And then someone like me who was there a few years and maybe is a bit more prone to the, oh, but what about the people who've been there from the beginning crew that still exists today?
Yeah, I mean, I'll straight up say I love DDM. I loved DDM when I walked in, and they weren't like my favorite. They were never my favorite faction. Like, obviously, I leaned on Stars and QQ just because, like, I went back and watched a lot. So like they were just the ones, but I always liked what DDM was doing. So I was like in the minority for a little bit, and then over time you just naturally saw that change. But a lot of that uncertainty and not committing to the group came, of course, with Giulia at the very start, right? That was pretty much all because of her. And it had nothing to do with the Syuris and Maikas of the world. It was all because of Giulia and wanting to or not wanting to commit to her, and how she joined the company and how she left her old company and how she went from 0 to 100 essentially in this company within a month. Like it didn't take long before it became very apparent that Giulia was going to be a big star in Stardom. And we kind of see it sometimes with the newer signings now, where I think like a lot of people do have that feeling, but none to the point of Giulia, where everyone's like, this just a lot of Western fans, because that's obviously who I'm going to go off of here, did not want anything to do with her. And here we are by the end, and she's one of the most popular wrestlers in the world. So it's crazy how things can change.
That is kind of the Stardom dialogue in a nutshell. Someone comes in, gets pushed hard to the moon. There's initial resistance and maybe apprehension, and then people get won over. And maybe when things begin to even out, they're more accepting. But like we saw it with Utami, the exact same thing. She came in, and we talked about it on her first year episode we covered not that long ago. She came in and like tore up the place, and people, whoa, what about this person? What about that person? And then same thing happened with Giulia. She came in and tore it up, and it worked to her character. Like whether that was the very original intention or not, it's hard to say because we can't get into the minds of Giulia and Rossi Agawa necessarily, but it feels like they almost would have known this isn't going to be well received by everyone. So let's lean into it and really play it off the character. And that led into Donna del Mondo, and we will see that once we're going through their early history. And it worked out so well for them. And then Giulia was just so charismatic and so hard not to appreciate, especially as she continued to improve her game, that any, lingering doubts or frustrations there was soon sort of, for the most part, washed away.
In the first 2 years of DDM, so what we're talking about today, I'll ask this before we officially jump in.
Mhm.
Is it the most successful 2 years any faction's ever had in Stardom? They won every title.
Yeah, look, I'm trying to think now if there's anyone that jumps out, and there really isn't. Because, like, you can't just say, oh, Queen's Quest because Io Shirai and then Momo Watanabe. Yeah, they won some other titles here and there, but they didn't have the full cross-court dominance that Donna del Mondo have. Now, at one point, they literally held every title, not every title, every person held a major title in Stardom.
Mhm.
And like it was pretty much across the board until very late into the picture Donna del Mondo. Like I don't think we're covering it in this first episode where Donna del Mondo is without any championship.
Yeah.
Those first 2 years, someone was always a champion in that promotion, in that group. Generally, there was at least 2 people as champion. Almost always, one of the major titles was wrapped around their waists. And even when it wasn't, they were still a major part of the story. And like you look at the Tam Nakano Giulia story where Tam gets frustrated that Giulia, loses her hair, loses her title, loses the match, comes back like, a week or 2 later and is cooler than ever and is as popular as ever. That was kind of Donna del Mondo. Even when they took a little misstep or struggled a little bit, they just seemed to be bigger and better than ever in short order.
So it all starts on October 14th, 2019, when Giulia officially joins Stardom. That was not the immediate start of DDM, obviously,
No.
but it is Giulia joining the company. She would not have her first match for a couple months from there, but
She
the
closed
immediate
out that show with Queen's Quest.
Yes. This is the immediate shift, though. It's Giulia coming in, Giulia instantly making a name for herself now in Stardom, leaving Ice Ribbon. And from there is where Stardom dramatically changes from here on out under Bushi Road, mind you. Like, this is fresh start of Bushi Road. This is them and Rossi Ogawa getting behind someone new right off the rip that wasn't in the company. And as I remember, a signing over Stardom talent wasn't too loved. And obviously, in Giulia's first couple months, a match with Hazuki didn't help her cause at all. When Hazuki was retiring, it was not all too keen of losing to Giulia on her way out, and she made that as known as she did. But of course, we've talked about this before on this podcast. A match with Hana Kimura started to turn the tides for Giulia at the end of the year, and that's really where we finally get to the DDM side of things, starting on January 14th, when Maika loses to Tommy Hayashishita, not in Stardom, but in just Tap Out, of course, Maika's old promotion. She was trained under Taka Michinoku, and, everyone knows that story, I'm sure, by now. But after the loss to Tommy, Giulia offer her a spot in a new group, officially getting the first member of DDM, which we would soon learn just 5 days later would also be adding former UFC fighter, former, pretty solid independent Joshi star Syuri. And that's just like the ultimate kick this into gear. I remember when Syuri came in and just like thinking, what is her role in the company, right? Because she is a veteran. She's older than a lot of other free agents you'd expect Stardom to bring in. She has pretty much done a little bit of everything. She's coming from UFC. And boy, oh boy, did we learn what her role ultimately was. We made the comparison to Mako Satomura kind of a bit in the Mako episodes, or episode, I think it was one episode. But the veteran presence ultimately turned into like such a huge addition to Stardom. And as we know with these three, the landscape was forever changed in this company.
bringing in Syuri for Donna del Mondo, is a genius act on a number of different reasons. One, Stardom, was losing several key names and several veteran presences, and at this stage we didn't realize they'd be losing some more after COVID. But she came in like perfect kind of person to bring in with Kagetsu leaving, because you wanted that extra veteran presence to really help out a young roster, show them the ropes, help them find the little things to make succeed. But then also putting her in a group like Donna del Mondo, because you've got someone like Giulia, who obviously she's come in the door and big things are expected of her. They have a lot of hope in what she can do. But she's only a couple of years into her career. She's still a little bit green around the edges. She's not the wrestler she would become yet. She needed help being guided, help sort of finding her way. And then you've got someone like Maika, who is very young into her career. I think she'd only been wrestling for about 6 months at that stage. And so having someone like Syuri there to basically help guide them through those early periods. Obviously, we know what would become of Syuri in Stardom, and she'd go on to become one of the most protected wrestlers in the company, one of the strongest wrestlers and best performers. But when she first came in, she wasn't immediately pushed to the top. They very wisely had her in almost like as that drag and roll, where it's like, we're going to lift up these people because we know with Syuri, we can flick that switch at any time. But help guide up that next group of people. And then obviously when someone like Maika would come in a little bit later, you've got that veteran presence just to train and guide them. And then when you're ready for her to, come in and dominate, she's there.
There's really a long-term story of that with Syuri. Ultimately, if you look at Shuri's run in Stardom, she was always the one to kind of guide the way, right? When Giulia falls out of favor after her big loss, she's the first World of Stardom champion out of these three. It's like she was, little did we know at the time when she joined, she was going to be such a big influence for this group and for Stardom as a whole. But she is as important of a signing as Stardom's ever had, because like you said, all of what happened during that time, right? And soon after this as well. Like Syuri came in, and they also, of course, lost Arisa Shiki to retirement and Hanakamura, who passed away. And she became all the more important, maybe even more important than she ever expected. You right, we just never know what the future would have held one way or the other with Syuri. But this is how you got DDM across, because it was so green and so new to wrestling as a whole, right? She's coming right from JTO. And I think the interesting thing here is that they did follow the usual tropes of a Stardom new faction, right? You win the artist belts, but they won more and more and more. It wasn't just the artist belts, right? Maika would go on to win the Future. Giulia would win the Wonder after winning the Cinderella, of course, and that's where everything just starts to click for this group. It is full on complete domination.
And it's very important to look at, obviously we're talking about the domination, we're looking at Syuri. People didn't realize how well they set up Syuri's character here, because you look at her history in Stardom. By the time she won the championship, she was incredibly well protected for someone who wasn't a major player at the time. It would have been very easy. No, she did not lose. And she was even when she wasn't the story, you could understand protecting Giulia because she'd just come in and you're pushing her to the moon. And they did protect Giulia, but they could have had Syuri maybe be a little bit of a scapegoat there and lose some matches. They looked after her incredibly well. So when they did pull the trigger on her to become the top champion, that dominant persona, going from more of a passive player to an active player, you had the story built up over a year and a half there where she just didn't lose anyways. And that helped bring the dominant allure of Donna del Mondo, because every faction, when they start, gets protected to a certain extent. Even with someone like Maika, who is green enough that you could justify her losing matches, they protected her as well. And obviously, that paid off well when she became the Future of Stardom champion, and obviously looking into 2024, and she's the red belt champion. But they made a point to make this faction feel like something different. Even when the status quo is to make a group dominant, they put in that extra 10 yards with this particular group.
Syuri, for these 4 years, is the most protected wrestler in the company. Right? We watched Giulia lose many times.
Yeah.
We watched Maika lose many times. We, like just not DDM only, but we watched so many other wrestlers lose plenty. Syuri, when Syuri loses, there's meaning behind it these days, and it's because of how much she was protected. And like you said, back then you don't really realize it, but looking back, it's like she was never, ever losing.
Yeah.
And she wasn't fully signed to this company until later in the year, mind you. She came in originally on kind of the not full freelance, but she was still doing other dates, and she wouldn't become official with Stardom until later in the year, which is again one of the biggest signings this company has made. And that's when they went full, they fully commit to her, and she started to win singles gold as well. But before we get there, it was February 8th that they won those artist belts, beating the trio of Utami, Momo, and Azumi. Pretty notable trio. And that was the last time. Was it the last time QQ won the belts?
I believe
it is.
It could be. I think it is, yeah.
Because DDM lost to. Who did they end up losing to? Whatever. Not important.
But it jumps like between Stars and Cosmic Angels, and then I
Right.
think it goes back to DDM, and yeah.
You get my point. The fact is, little did we know Queen's Quest would have touched these belts much after that. But let's continue forward now here. So a big thing for them obviously is that Giulia wins the Cinderella tournament. This is where her push fully kicks into gear. But at the same time, COVID really starts to hit in full force and makes them essentially, shut down for the most part. They obviously hold no people gate and stuff like that, but it was full on shut down all the way until June 21st, which was their first proper show back. And DDM did not come by themselves, adding a new member, of course, that being Maika, really starting to make that original core. Because I think most Stardom fans look at the true DDM as the 5.
Yes.
And as we know, based off of the past year, how important Maika was to this group and its growth. And she was also someone coming in very green still. And I think that's just so interesting what DDM was willing, not DDM, but Stardom was willing to do with DDM and these wrestlers, right? Because you have Syuri, but like you said, Giulia was still pretty new to wrestling, and then Maika and Maika, I mean, they were greener than green in many ways when joining, but they still just went fully behind them.
Yeah, it's very easy to forget that the original core trio for Donna del Mondo are not a trio for that long in terms of active Stardom time, because obviously they come together mid-January, they win the title start of February. By the end of that month, everything's locked up. It's COVID, lockdowns and stuff. They come back for the 2 shows, and obviously that's awkward because the Cinderella tournament is one of those shows, and that's all separated by individual matches. And then you just get a tag match for the other No People Gate with Maika and Giulia. So, like, you don't get that long with just that core trio, and then you get Maika coming in at the very beginning of the return era for Stardom, and that's when that dynamic begins to come through. And I think the core 5 that we will eventually see come through a little bit later is the group. But I don't think they felt like Donna del Mondo in retrospect until Maika comes in, because of how important she is to the dynamics within that group. And she brings in something that is, to me, is essential for what makes Donna del Mondo. And that is that kind of, they're very close to each other, but they're competitive with each other. They're not afraid to go at one another when they feel like they're the best person in this group.
It wasn't too soon after this that we'd start to see the dynamics in DDM begin to change when they had to compete against one another. And that's a big point in their history, this group's history. And I think that's what makes DDM so unique, right? So many of these wrestlers' biggest wins came against one another. And I think that's just such a interesting story to tell within a faction, especially because of how long they lasted together, how long that they were on top for, and things like that. Like, this is an unprecedented move in some ways And those relationships of, you know, someone losing to another person in the group and so on, that's how this group got better. That's how this group got stronger. But of course, Giulia wins the World of Stardom Championship officially on July 26th, beating Tam for the vacant title. And, you know, that goes on forever. We're still dealing with those two. We'll get back to them. Don't worry. Not too worried about that.
You think Tam will pop back up in this story?
Yeah, a few times. It's just the way the Tam Road goes. She just makes sure she pops up in every single story 25 times. But maybe the biggest change in the DDM dynamic is when Maika defeats Giulia in the 5-star Grand Prix, right? Because that's the first time Giulia takes such a big loss like that, and a shocking loss at that. Of course, Maika goes on to get to the 5-star Grand Prix final, which is a big deal in itself. But beating Giulia is the first time we start to see something happen in DDM between the members where Giulia isn't the dominant force, isn't the lead force. It's Maika that gets the big win.
Yeah, obviously Giulia's leading this group, but she's young enough that she doesn't have necessarily the experience to know how to handle the leadership role quite yet. Obviously, Syuri's there to help her and back her up, but like she's there. She's obviously, you know, on top of the world. Her ego is probably as big as ever at this point because everything's gone right for her. She's built this incredible faction. She's waltzed into stardom, beat everyone that they've thrown against her. She's won the Cinderella. She's won the white belt. And then someone she helps bring in and helps train. You know, it's not necessarily addressed on air, but like when Maika signed with Stardom, it was during COVID and she trained with Giulia extensively, got herself a lot fitter, got herself looking in a, you know, she comes into Stardom looking completely different to when she was pre-Stardom. It's a dramatic change. And Giulia's helped build this, and then all of a sudden the person she's helped craft, helped create, beats her and gloats over her. This is a very arrogant young Maika who beats Giulia and suddenly thinks she is the number one person in Donna del Mondo. And you see this pop up every now and again in factions, especially like Queen's Quest. You see it at times, but it doesn't feel like quite the same butting of heads that you see here with Donna del Mondo and would see in the future as well.
Anytime one of them lost to another member, it created a new story. It created a new something to focus on, right? Because in the 5-star, every year, almost a faction member beats a fellow faction member, right? And it's like, okay, whatever, we move on, whether it's the leader or not. Even so, like we saw, you know, Nagi Sayaka beat Tam the year after this, and they went on to have a title, and they kind of did like the faction thing, but it's not like this because this would continue and continue and continue. But before we get to Giulia kind of getting back to the top of this group, we finally complete the DDM that everyone knows and love, and that is, of course, when Natsumi Maki, better known to the world as Natsupoi, joins Stardom, makes her debut and joins the group. They had kind of teased this in the lead up. People kind of figured it out when, you know, Natsumi Maki was disappearing from certain groups. And I remember when Natsupoi joined, and little did I think I know at the time, I was like, this was the perfect addition, because she brought just such a different level to this group, because everyone was kind of stoic and strong, and you have the smaller Natsupoi who brings a lot of character and charisma and a completely different in-ring style, right? Like the other four are built to be main event style wrestlers, and Natsupoi is there to be not only their high speed option, but at the time people expected to kind of be the one that eats the pins, which is kind of funny to think about because obviously where Natsupoi's grown to since then. But this 5 it really did feel complete when she joined.
Yeah, look, as much as like we can point at Maika as kind of coming in and defining the group doesn't become truly complete and doesn't feel like the Donna del Mondo that would win everyone over until Natsupoi comes in. And even that, like, I think was a process, because when she came in, she adopted the mannerisms of Donna Del Mondo a little bit more. Look, she came out riding on Maika's shoulders. You could sense she's a little bit more fun and easygoing than the rest of the group at this stage. But she comes in with a little bit more of that arrogance and egocentrism that you saw in the rest of the group. And it isn't until I think they've gotten used to each other a little bit more that they expand into that more friendly, fun aspects that we see everyone in that group is perfect at doing. They just needed the right timing and opportunity to do so. But when she comes in with that core five, she's riding on Himeka's shoulders. It does feel like, okay, this group is complete, because every faction kind of needs that high speed wrestler to represent them beyond just the big bruising main event style, as you mentioned.
And I think that's such an important point, I should say, is that like these are a bunch of wrestlers coming together who weren't even in the company, a year before Natsupoi debuted.
Yeah.
Right. None of these wrestlers were officially in the company. We had never seen, well, Syuri obviously had stepped in Stardom before, but we had never seen them.
And Natsumi,
and Natsumi did too. But in terms of like roster members, and they're all learning on the fly together to not only get used to the Stardom style and where this company is going, but they're trying to get used to each other.
Yeah.
And I think Natsupoi plays such a big part because she does bring the egotistic feel to this group in the long term, right? We listen, if you saw this group then, and then within a year you're watching Maika and Himeka dance with Natsupoi in the middle of the ring, it's like, what happened, right? Like, what happened to DDM? And I think that says it all of how important she was to this faction and the long-term dynamic. It's why when she left, because I think when Syuri left, it's very different. We'll get to that. But when she left, I thought everything changed for DDM.
I absolutely agree. Syuri was almost a necessary departure because she had grown to that point. And like we talk about the infighting within Donna Del Mondo, but they kind of realized they've reached a point where this is going to go too far.
Yep.
But Natsupoi leaving, like, you're not getting rid of someone who was basically competing for that leadership spot. You're getting rid of the heart of the group.
Yeah.
And it tore them apart, and you saw that in how they responded to what happened. And yeah, we'll get into that later, but it's good to point out, knowing now when she comes in here in October, why it's such a big deal, both in the short term and the long term for this group.
So the group's first major loss would come in November of that same year when they dropped the Artist of Stardom titles to Oedo Tai. And the Artist titles would change a lot. That's not a big shock, but considering they held them for, I believe, 280 days, they held the belts. Obviously,
that's a big deal at this time.
COVID played a part in that, but still, that's a long time. And that's their first big loss, but it wouldn't hurt them all too much, as we know. Giulia would defend the title against Maika on October 29th, getting her win back over the Jumbo Princess and kind of moving us forward now with Giulia feeling more comfortable back in her top role. I think we saw that, right? Every time they wrestled, like, oh, Giulia lost. Is this a new leader? It's like, she wasn't, for someone that came into this company so in command, anytime Giulia lost, some of that command fell, right? Some of that leadership fell. Some of that things came into question. And obviously, as we see in 2021, that couldn't have been tested more when for a lot of the year, she didn't even feel like the leader anymore.
Yeah.
She kind of took a back seat, and that's what I think they were setting us up for, is that anytime she loses, there's this big dramatic shift in how this group goes. And obviously she gets her win back here, but that lead up to this was very notable.
It showed that her leadership wasn't assured. Yeah,
Mhm.
when you've got someone like a veteran like Syuri there, obviously there's going to be that latent kind of what if things change here. But when you've got an upstart like Maika coming in and challenging that leadership the way she did, even if it was only for a couple of months and very, just over the span of 2 matches, it's enough to rattle the fence. And it is
Mhm.
important in, as you said, establishing what would come in the next year when it's not just the external forces of someone within the group impacting it, but it's very much just where she sits in the presence of the company. She was no longer assured to be the focal point, even though she couldn't help but make herself kind of find her way into the top spots regardless. It felt different than it did in this first full
Yep.
year in 2020.
Soon after this, Maika would lose the future Stardom Championship. However, Syuri would add the SWA title to her repertoire, and obviously we know how that reign would go. But that really was the kickoff to Syuri becoming a very important part of DDM and her standing in the group. Because as we'd see in 2021, she'd become the unofficial leader in some ways, kind of, not only being the head champion because she was the one with the singles belt once Giulia lost hers, but she had to pretty much help Giulia climb her way back up. So that brings us, of course, to the big event, March 3rd, All-Star Dream Cinderella main event, hair versus hair for the Wonder of Stardom Championship, and Giulia falls to Tam Nakano. Yes, we promised she'd come back. Don't you worry. She did come back. Giulia gets in. Listen, if you're a new Stardom fan, if you are a newer fan to Joshi, hair versus hair in the world of Joshi is very different from hair versus hair in, say, the world of WWE. There's a lot of meaning to these stipulations. It is a moment of failure. It is a moment of kind of getting yourself broken down, and you have to then build yourself back up. And from this point, we watch that in real time. Giulia, we kind of make jokes of the GI Giulia, and she completely transforms her style as a result. She went from the big match wrestler who did more technical stuff and a little bit more grappling to a hard-nosed brawler that we would all go on to love from there. And as doing so after losing this match, like I just said with Syuri, you kind of start to see the command change in DDM. Giulia is always the leader, right? They never change from her being the leader, but for much of 2021, she did not feel like the leader.
And this came at a very important time because earlier in that show, Natsupoi won the high speed title from Azumi, and in doing so, it reaches that point we talked about where every wrestler in Donna del Mondo had a championship. And then the other one was Maihima had the tag titles at this point. But then just a couple hours later, that's no longer the case. And the person who's dropped the ball is their leader, is Giulia. And so for this period she's going through, and obviously her not being a champion doesn't last that long. And I will say that's the one area of Donna Del Mondo's storytelling in this period in particular, I wish they'd stretched it out a little bit more. Because the whole situation with Giulia, Julie, she came in first match back without the hair. She wrestles Fukigen Death. She's starting from the bottom. She said that herself. And it feels like that was the only time when she was starting from the bottom. She'd come in, they'd challenge the tag titles against Maihime, win the titles. And even though she's still finding herself and redeveloping herself, while Syuri is basically acting as the unofficial leader and dominating presence of the group, I wish they just waited an extra couple of months maybe to make the switch with the tag titles, just to give that rebuilding concept a little bit more weight to it. And not just because it would have meant Himeka would have held the titles for a bit longer.
I absolutely agree, though. I do feel like they got a second chance with Giulia getting hurt, if that makes sense, because it felt like the big bump that had to make her again reset.
Yes.
But I absolutely agree with you. I do think that had they waited even one more month, it would have just had a different dynamic, because a lot of the fun in that early going was seeing Giulia try to figure things out. But like you
it's
said,
almost like they realized, like the whole idea was, oh no, she's embarrassed, she shaved her head. It's almost like they saw her with the shaved head and go, oh, she's still too damn cool to pull off this rebuilding aspect, so screw it.
It was like, I remember because the first time she showed up, obviously she had the completely shaved head. She wore a baseball cap, the army pants and a tank top.
And
And
the
then
aviators.
yeah, and then from there it was just like, oh, she's cooler. Ah, shit, she's even cooler. Ah, man, what do we do here? It was like she doesn't like. It's rare when someone gets their head shaved that they end up just being cooler, especially when you're Giulia, because like
Yeah.
Giulia was already cool. But as we saw through like her transitions of this look, she became undeniable just by her appearance. And I think you're right. That might have been part of it. They're like, ah, crap. But like you said, everyone was champion at the time, no longer, but Giulia was no longer. So Syuri kind of, okay, levels up, kind of, the unofficial leader. That's whose theme song's playing, for example. That's always important. It's always important. Um, but once again, we get to see the challenges within a group when Syuri and Giulia come together as a tag team, ALK, to make my life easier, because I will butcher uh, the exact name. But ALK would go on to be a fantastic team, obviously, but they had to defeat Maihime to do so. And I think this was a big shift, not only in the DDM realm for Giulia, obviously kind of getting back on the horse, but it really did feel like Syuri was kind of leading her in many ways through this group. Uh, I remember when this match was announced, and I even more so remember it when it was the main event, and people were not happy. And I just to set a picture of like what happened on this show. Bea Priestley announced right before this that she's leaving the company. Also, in a completely non-Stardom world, Will Ospreay wins the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship. And going into this main event, I think a lot of people that were watching live at the time were starting to almost be checked out because they're like, well, there's so much going on, But what these four went on to do in that main event was prove that they should have been the main event. And I think that's very key here because a tag title main event, especially at this time, Utami had now had 2 straight shows of not getting the main event as World of Stardom champion. That was big. Like that was a big deal. I remember that vividly. It's like, are you gonna go with her? Or are you gonna like keep making her? And the Wonder only main evented over once. The tag belt, it was pretty much like, oh, Giulia over everyone, even though she's supposed to be building herself back up. So that all goes into this. There's still not full on committed love to Giulia at this time or DDM because they're main eventing over the World of Stardom Champion. But once this match was over, I remember just being like, wow, that was fantastic. ALK is fantastic. But there, even so, if you were a DDM fan, there were still many that were upset with the decision of Maihime losing the belts. They did not get a long run with the belts. And as we know now, they never got another one.
Why do you have to hit me in the heart and remind me like that?
I know.
It's funny though, like we look at this situation, and at the time I was one of the people who was pissed off. I will admit it. Like All Star Dream Cinderella, like it made a certain amount of sense because Giulia Tan, they had the long overarching story, the hair stipulation. You could make the justification for that, and the white belt is, as we've talked about, pretty much on that level. The tag belts, though, it did feel like a bit of a slap in the face to Utami. Little did we probably appreciate the time that this story here with Utami not getting the main events is actually really important to her character development as champion because she's walking away from these shows doubting herself and questioning herself because she's meant to be the top champion. She's the one meant to be closing out, but they're not giving her these spots. And she's asking why, what do I need to change about herself? And it's through that self-discovery that she becomes the Utami that faces Syuri and really begins to unlock in the second half of her run as champion, the true queen of Stardom, the Red Queen that she is. So even though at the time it was annoying and frustrating to see Utami maybe not getting her opportunities, even if Bea Priestley didn't feel like a main event level challenger compared to ALK versus Maihime, that decision not only set up Donna del Mondo even more so, but it was very integral to Utami's story by the end of that year. So like a lot of things, actually, when you look at the Donna del Mondo story, it's a decision that you step back and go, really, at the time, and in hindsight, whether intentionally or not, it has actually worked out for the better.
DDM had a lot of branches throughout the company because of what they did, and that's one of them, right? With Utami, it almost like long term, it's like, oh, that made sense. It made her better. It made her greater. And it's not like she didn't deliver with Saya Kamatani at All-Star Dream Cinderella. Like that was a match that I think everyone walked away from like, what the hell just happened? Who saw that happening? Right? For both wrestlers, not just Utami, but obviously Saya Kamatani had all the doubt in the world of many, because they were like, really? They're going to put her in this spot? But we fast forward now here. So ALK's champions, Mahime takes a step back. And I think it's very important. But before we get to like what the big accolades towards the end of the year, because you knew they were getting back on the road, right? They were going to be fine. But they face off multiple matches in the Cinderella involve these wrestlers. Maika defeats Giulia in the tournament shoot, ultimately go on to the finals before losing to Saya Kamatani. Syuri had beaten Natsupoi in the first round. All the meanwhile, ALK is beating the top tag teams of this promotion. They beat Momoaz, they beat MK Sisters. But that brings us to maybe the most dramatic change, I think, in the world of DDM. And that, of course, is Utami Hayashishita versus Syuri at Tokyo Dream Cinderella. Everything changes from there. Not only with DDM, but with Stardom, with everything. That match shifted what might have been plans for the next year to 2 years with DDM, Giulia, Syuri, everything. And I think it's very key we talk about that.
Absolutely. Syuri, as we've talked about, she was incredibly well protected here. You know, she was treated like someone who was dangerous, difficult to defeat, but it never felt like she was treated as like they almost like Brock Lesnar type figure, that person with the real world martial arts experience who is just impossible to figure out, impossible to beat. And even coming into this match, like they built it up well. This was a match with really good build. Both wrestlers committed to it. But it was in the aftermath of this match with the incredible 43-minute draw, with Dave Meltzer giving this 5.5 stars, which is still something that is almost proving like an impossible metric for every other wrestler in Joshi to reach at this point. As you said, like it feels like the dynamics here changed completely, because before then, Syuri was a dangerous wrestler who you could kind of use to build up others around them. After this match, it almost felt like, okay, Stardom realized they need to use Syuri to her full degree. And they did.
Everyone was convinced around this time that Giulia was going to be winning the 5-star Grand Prix.
The story was there, the rebuild, the resurrection.
Yeah, it made sense. It just made too much sense. It's like, this is Stardom booking 101, makes all the sense in the world. And that's when we fast forward to the 5-star Grand Prix. And I think the best thing that ever happened to Giulia is getting injured. And I don't say that in a bad way. Like, getting injured, you don't want anyone to get injured. But her road to the title and her road to full on redeeming herself and getting to the top of Stardom once again benefited so much from not being able to win this tournament.
All you have to do is look at the general impression of Giulia at this point and a year later. Fans have been starting to turn around on her in the sort of the 6 months between her losing her hair and the 5-star Grand Prix. There was the change beginning to happen. People were starting to come around on Giulia, but it wasn't complete yet. And I think in a certain sense, people had resigned themselves to, okay, Giulia's winning the 5-star Grand Prix. She's beating Utami. She's winning the red belt. And it was almost like we would rather it not happen, but at least like she's improved. She's proven herself a little bit more. The injury delayed that, in theory, by a year. You know, we sit here, we're sort of talking as if Giulia was going to win as well. We can't know for sure, but whether she was meant to or not, having to wait a year and giving her the story of, well, she didn't lose the 5-star Grand Prix. She had to bow out due to injury. Injury exacerbated by one of her teammates, no less, with Maika. That extra year got her to the point whereby, 2022 5-star Grand Prix, everyone is all in on the Giulia train. They want to see her win the 5-star Grand Prix. They want to see her become champion. And just a year prior, that still seemed ridiculous. But they got there, and that extra year did everything to create that.
As a result of the injury, of course, the story wrote itself. Syuri would go on to win the 5-star Grand Prix, lock in her shot at the first ever Stardom Dream Queendom at the end of the year, setting up the ultimate rematch with Utami Hayashishita. Ultimately, it all felt right in the end. Like, again, you never want to wish injury, but Syuri being the one to get that moment at the end of the year because of what she had done all year long, kind of becoming the unofficial leader of DDM and being the one to push her group forward when Giulia was down on her luck, and having that match with Utami that changed the way people watch Stardom and making a lot of new fans as a result and making people pay attention. No one else should have been winning that tournament. And obviously, I'm looking back on it, and obviously I know what would happen from there. But even then, when she won, it felt right. There was never a moment it felt wrong. I remember it wasn't the first time that, like, I think collectively everyone was happy about a DDM win, but man, it sure felt like it.
Syuri carries that respect, and we've talked about it since she came into the company, but even amongst the Stardom fans who maybe weren't as enamored with Donna del Mondo coming in and tearing up the place, everyone kind of like, yeah, but Syuri she deserves all of this. She's that good. She's a legitimate, believable top contender. And her rise to the top was so much more organic than Giulia's, because while they were pushing Giulia hard, while they pushed to make her hard out of the gate, Syuri's just casually there, racking up wins, looking like a dominating presence, but never overbearing the situation. It all felt natural. When Giulia falls short and loses her hair, Syuri's helping her, pick back up and win the tag titles and regrow herself. It just all kind of makes sense. When Utami, who, was a mega push wrestler in her own right, can't get past Syuri, it all just kind of makes sense. And coming to that 5-star Grand Prix, when Syuri ended up winning and then beating Utami, it all just made sense. It benefited Giulia waiting the extra year. It benefited Syuri because she went on to become, the top champion for a year, wrestler of the year in PWI, which was a almost crazy feat in of itself looking at it. And it benefited Utami because it gave her that true rival to overcome that her character needed as well.
I think from here, obviously, the big story was no longer about the Syuri Giulia dynamic with Giulia out of action. Instead, the change came with Mahime Poi. Mahime Poi would go on to win the Artists of Stardom Championships by defeating Cosmic Angels, who had been the most dominant champions of that time. They'd go on to break that record, spoiler alert, but we'll get to that at a later time. But the big story, of course, was the drama between Natsupoi and Himeka that would begin to unfold. And there was a lot of points here. It was very confusing at the time because it's like, what? Why? It's like, why is this happening? They just won the belts. Everything should be good. But it was, again, proving that DDM controlled the headlines, right? Even with Giulia not even around, Syuri waiting to get her big match, they're still having this big story going on to close out the year.
I love this story for several reasons. One of it's because it
was right.
It involves some of my favorite wrestlers in Stardom, but it was also a title that, even though championships were involved, they were secondary. Like, the fact that they were champions only added to the drama, but it wasn't the reason for the drama. And it all kind of came about during the tag league, primarily when Himeka and Natsupoi were paired together. They had the press conference. Natsupoi brings out a contract for Himeka to sign, that's basically saying, "You will not leave me. You will not abandon me." And it's played up. It's all in good fun. It's Natsupoi being Natsupoi. By this point, a
Yeah.
year after she'd come in, the whole group had kind of become more relaxed. They could joke with each other a bit more.
As we
had
saw with ALK entrances, obviously, when they were wearing
ALK
the mask and
entrances,
dancing. And
My Himapoi entrances doing the idol dance routine, Maika coming out in a bear costume. Like, it was all kind of that chill, relaxed, fun kind of thing. And then so that thing was all played and fun too. But during the tournament, yeah, they're a good team together, but it's not quite clicking. And then on the final night of the tag tournament, there's some miscommunication. It cost them the spot in the finals. There's some latent frustration there. And you can sense, like, even though these two are the closest and longest friends in Donna del Mondo, because they knew each other before Stardom, back when they were doing Acres Girls together.
Yep.
So there's a lot of history between these two. And Natsupoi's looking at Himeka and kind of going, yeah, I don't think you've got the passion that you should. You're kind of getting by just on your strength and physical
I was
feature.
coming back.
the passion was waiting. And then you had Maika kind of looking at Natsupoi and calling her egotistical and self-centered and stuff. And it blows up all through these next couple of months. And you're looking at poor Maika in the middle going, how does she fix this? And then they get lumped in a three-way match to determine the number one contender for the Wonder of Stardom title. Of course, that's not going to go down well. Instead of working together, they cost each other a spot. Sai Kamitani wins. And as we know, that win was important for Kamitani. She goes on to win the white belt. It feels like, obviously we've had this drama in Donna del Mondo before, also involving Maika, quite funnily enough. But this is the first time I think Donna del Mondo really felt like they were in trouble as a group. Something had to give here because they didn't feel like they're going to be able to easily fix this.
It really felt like 1 year after they had come to completion, one of these two were leaving.
Yes.
There was a lot of debate on who would be the one that would leave. Where would this road go? Because a lot of times in Stardom, the history is when something like this happened, when a beef happens between stablemates, someone's got to go. But as we learned with the running of DDM and how they were as a group, they were not just like everyone else. Right? Everything else is different when it comes to DDM.
Yep.
And Mahime Poi, as I said, broke a record. That kind of gives you the spoiler alert that these two would come back together in a very unique fashion. So there was a 10 million yen trios tournament that concluded in a ladder match on December 18th. I don't remember the name of the show.
Osaka Super Wars.
Thank you. Osaka Super. Oh, yeah, I forgot we had the Super Wars back in the day. So this would ultimately become Gold Rush in a different weird form, obviously, with a big ball that is hung above the ring and so on. But this was the creation of that. But this was about the story. And they had also put the titles on the line.
Himeka put the titles on the line specifically. She put them on. She didn't talk to the rest of her group. And they were like, what?
It was the ultimate test of, could this trio continue on? Could these two coexist, come back together? And by the end of the match, yes. Like, it for a ladder match stipulation, they did the best they could to make this about a story.
Yeah. And they pulled it off perfectly. Like, it obviously doesn't reach the levels of the Queen's Quest cage match, but this tugs at similar heartstrings because, obviously, like, the issues coming together. And importantly, with this type of match too, because Stardom don't like to run their stipulation matches just normally, you could also eliminate people from the match. So if you got pinned, you were technically out of the match. Maika gets eliminated. I think she loses because of the moonsault off the ladder from Mayu Iwatani. She's out of this. So it is literally the two people beefing that have to work together. And they get the opportunity, they sort of fight through and stuff, and it's just them in the ring. Now, conventional wisdom would say Himeka climbs up, she pulls it down, they win, they celebrate. She actually helps lift Natsupoi up the ladder and specifically wants her to win the match. And it reminds me a lot, looking into the future, of Utami lifting Lady C out of the cage. She recognized that, look, she could go for the glory, but she does the team thing. and gives that opportunity to someone else. And so Natsupoi is helped up. She pulls down what needs to be pulled down, and they celebrate. Donna del Mondo are fine on top of the ladder. Everything's going to work out okay.
It's a story that I think Stardom does so well. Obviously, right? You're referencing that cage match that was so celebrated in 2023. But it's a story that if you have the right wrestlers in place, it doesn't matter what the match is, they're going to make it work. And I think the way this match was set up was really so perfect, because it was like, I remember just going into this tournament, I did not think about these three at all, like in terms of like the tournament itself. And mind you, they put the titles on the line in every match. It wasn't just the finals. Maika said, we're putting them on the line in every match. So they're getting all these free defenses at the same time. So congratulations to them. But those eliminations in the end to get Maika out and make these two have to work together, it's just how Stardom tells stories in such a unique way that I don't think other companies do. But obviously the Mahime Poi trio, one of the most beloved trios, truthfully, in Stardom history, and we'll get more to them in the next episode of this. But around this time as well, there's a lot going on in DDM. Big shock. Syuri's getting ready for a big title match at the end of the year, and Giulia's return match had been announced. She would be facing a Konami, who would be on her way out of the company and we know Konami obviously would come back time and time again, but she was no longer going to be a full-time competitor with the company. Giulia making her grand return at Stardom Dream Queendom, but at the same time, there are some Momo masks running around and causing havoc in the world of Stardom. And that brings us to the year-end climax, when it would be revealed that Giulia was one of them, essentially the ringleader of the Momo mask. And we'd have to wait, and you'll have to wait until we really can get into that, which is an entirely new era, really, for DDM as a whole. But the Momo masks were the ones attacking. She revealed that they would be joining the group at the beginning of the new year, and that was that. Giulia would then, of course, go on to wrestle a week later. But
I do want to specify for those listening who may not have been watching around this time, when we say Momo masks, we're not talking about them running out in Momo Watanabe masks, although that would have been hilarious, or Momo Kogo masks. The Momo thing it's like a online viral character meme thing, sort of like a deformed face, scary horror Halloween looking thing. I still think they should have been Momo Watanabe masks, though.
That would be pretty funny. But yeah, so that was a key part of the end of the year for Stardom as well. A lot of uncertainty, but as we learned, there would be new members of the group. But that brings us to our final destination here on this episode, and that, of course, is the first ever Stardom Dream Queendom, December 29th, 2021. Giulia would return early in the night, paying homage to Hana Kimura in her return match against Konami, who of course would be heading out. And obviously that would end up being such a beautifully told match that wasn't about the Giulia return, wasn't even about the Konami leaving. It ended up being about Hana Kimura. And I think that's when we finally reached the level of everyone was in on Giulia, truthfully. They were just like, okay, how can we dislike her? And she came back with this awesome look, and it's like, oh, this is Giulia, right? Yeah. This is the leader. This is the DDM leader that we saw get taken away all the way back at All-Star Dream Cinderella. And later in the night, Syuri makes sure to remind everyone who has been running this ship for most of the year by defeating Utami Hayashishita, ending the year-plus long reign and winning the World of Stardom Championship, becoming the first in DDM to do exactly that, and starting what would be a trickle effect in every way within this group. Because now, if she wasn't the leader before, she is the World of Stardom Champion with a returning Giulia who has her confidence back. things weren't going to last all happy and fine from there.
And I think it's very important to compare this situation to the last championship situation because it's a very similar situation. Queen's Quest, Momo Watanabe is the leader. Utami Hayashishita comes through, wins the World of Stardom Championship. And all the while Momo struggling to kind of assert herself. And there's a breaking point. It doesn't stick. Momo leaves Queen's Quest. She betrays them. She goes to Oedo Tai. And then you've got this situation. Syuri isn't the leader of the group. Giulia is. But Giulia's been hitting a few setbacks. She's coming in. She still believes she's the best, just like Momo believes she was the best. But here you have someone else donned in red, both in attire and in championships. And you have to start wondering... It looks good for Donna del Mondo. Everything's working out. Natsupo and Himeka have worked out the differences. They're trios champions. Giulia's finally back. She's fully healthy. Syuri's a top champion. Everything's happy again in Donna del Mondo. But for how long was always the question.
Spoiler alert.
Especially with Giulia bringing in 2 new people that we did not know about.
And just to further the dominance, Syuri was a triple champion at this time. She had the World of Stardom Champion, the SWA Championship, and one half of the Goddess belts. And as we'd see in the year 2022, the beauty, the excitement, the unbelievable dominance of DDM would start to be greatly affected. Everything would change from there. But that's for next episode. For now,
cliffhanger.
For now, enjoy what is currently DDM at its tip-top shape, right? Everyone feels like they are at the max potential in many ways. And momentum is on their side. Just take that and appreciate it, because next episode gets a lot more sad for this group. It's gonna be tough. Because everything was right for DDM, the dominance, the greatness, and we'll get to it next time around. But what a 2-year run it was.
It was a dominant performance. Even when the cracks started to appear in this group, they painted over it very quickly. Maybe they just didn't fix those cracks, as we'll find out.
The comparisons to the Jordan Bulls were not a bad one at this time. It was very much the truth, especially when this show closed out. It just felt like no one could stop DDM.
Scottie Pippen didn't win no finals MVP.
No one can stop DDM except themselves, as we'd soon learn. But that's it for this edition of the Stardom Road podcast. A lot shorter than our previous episodes. We're back on theme now, everybody. You're welcome. No promises for the next 2 episodes. But before we say goodbye, Trent, the people know where they can find you, what you got going on, and all that good stuff.
You can find me on Twitter /X at OneUpCulture. If you want to hear more of me, you can hear me again on the Ocean Cyclone Show with Ryan and Scott, of course. You can hear me doing ChocoCast with Window Jeff, covering all things Gatto Move. I occasionally write articles when I'm in the mood. I'm in the mood to start planning articles. Doesn't mean they'll get written, but we'll see. And I'm also very excited because I'm planning to head to Japan very, very shortly. That's neither here nor there. But I guess follow me on Twitter because I'll be posting images and talking about my time there.
You follow me at Scotty Wrestling on Twitter /X. Like you said, Ocean Cyclone Show. Go give that a listen. By the time this episode's out,
Hot takes
will be coming out, I think.
I think coming out, or
it'll be coming out the upcoming weekend. So definitely, you want to check that one out because it's always fun to see how wrong we are by the end of the year.
And occasionally right.
Yeah, sometimes we're really on the nose, and sometimes we couldn't be more off. But that's the beauty.
Well, one of the ones where one of us was particularly off from last year heavily involved Donna del Mondo.
It sure did, and let's just say that was before that, like right after, was it before or after the episode happened?
1 week after the episode aired, where we discussed whether Maika would win a singles title before Maika. Himeka announced her retirement. I may have bet on the wrong horse.
We could argue. But since this is also a Stardom pay-per-view weekend, I'll have coverage for that one way or the other for Supreme Fight, if that interests you. If you're listening to this months down the line, ignore that. Yes. And overall, thank you for listening, everybody. We always appreciate it. Check out the other podcasts here on the Count Out Podcast Network. We'll be back with part 2 in 2 weeks and part 3 2 weeks after that, and so on and so forth. So for Trent, I'm Scott. This was Stardom Road. Until next time, see ya.
Every year, the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame receives a new crop of potential inductees. And on our new Count Out Patreon series titled The Ballot, it's our job to discuss whether or not these newbies should become Hall of Fame wrestlers. Hello, my name is Ryan 19. Every month, a guest and I will analyze the regional careers of newly balloted wrestlers for the Observer Hall of Fame. Are they day one votes? Do they belong at all? Find out on the ballot every month on patreon.com/countoutpod. Again, check out the ballot on patreon.com/countoutpod. We hope to see you there. This has been a Count Out Podcast.